Well, here we all are again. Having recently spoken about things being canon and not, it seemed to me the most sensible starting point to move on to something safe, something less controversial, something regularly requested by you all, and so that's why I've chosen to talk today about the much celebrated figure for some of the minor chaos god known as Malice. Firstly, before anything else, it's important to be aware that much like the terms Mechanicum and Mechanicus, which are constantly incorrectly placed, sometimes even in official material, the titles of Malal and Malice are also regularly confused and misused as either referring to the same thing or as separate entities but mixed up and placed incorrectly. Likely many of you know this story and the details, but I'd expect that just as many do not, which is why I decided to include Malal in the title so I can hopefully catch all and explain this. Regardless though, today we're primarily talking about Malice. Now I'll expand specifically on the issue of Malal later, but the most critical thing to know is that Malal was a figure from the Warhammer fantasy verse. It has never been a thing at any time in 40k, nor is it ever likely to be. Within the galaxy of 40k we speak about the largely unseen and mysterious entity known only as Malice. Now, it is also important to address straight out of the gate that many people will consider Malice to be something that is no longer established and recognised in the lore, and for my own sanity, I will avoid using the R word. However, it will probably please many of you with less sweating palms to know that I consider this not to be the case, and as usual I will hopefully illustrate to you with very clear reference why that is. Most notably is that despite it not being very explicitly stated, Malice has been referenced in some form via the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 7th, and some of you might be shocked to learn 8th edition of 40k via the Sons of Malice. Not only in the novel Cadia Stands, where they are quite literally being described as active, not merely mentioned as an aside, but they also appear via the 2019 Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2 game, which I will now play for you to illustrate.
The Skelos subsector is located to the galactic west of the Eye of Terror. Its capital planet, Skelos, is a feral world and was once the homeworld of the Sons of Malice. Once loyal space marines, they turned on the Imperium in the years leading to the 13th Black Crusade. The original name of the Sons of Malice has been lost to Imperial record, but it is speculated that they were one of the 20 chapters of the Astartes Precis, a founding created with the express purpose of safeguarding the region surrounding the Eye of Terror. The cold and unforgiving wastes of Skelos provide the Sons of Malice no shortage of barbaric recruits. Indeed, the Sons' foul religious practices trace their origins to those of the tribesmen from which they sprang. A scouring conducted by the Cadian 331st was thought to have ended these grisly traditions. Certainly the natives were thought exterminated, and the Sons of Malice driven off.
Now quite simply, what more proof do you require? I could probably just leave it there really, but I'll note that the most explicit reference comes from the 2009 5th edition short story The Labyrinth, focused entirely on the Sons of Malice. Now granted this is only a short story, it's only 25 pages long, it's part of an anthology, but it does give a good amount of background to the Sons of Malice and even to Malice. And given all that I've mentioned already, it seems that the Eldar are not the only ones using obscure pieces of lore referenced from the 3rd edition that are currently forming 8th edition lore. And this I would hope makes it immediately clear that it's far more difficult for anyone to make the argument against Malice than it is for it in the galaxy of the 42nd millennium. I also hope that this adds to my conversation recently about what is and isn't considered established, or yes, I'll say it, canon. Now, I would also make a note of a relatively common contention that some people claim, which is that Malice is not in fact a god of any kind, and instead Malice is something more akin to, say, a powerful demon. Now, it would be wrong of me to say that this was an impossibility, but I personally think it's fairly clear that this is not the intention. It's also revealed in the Labyrinth that the Sons of Malice successfully reveal an unusual and disturbing ability, that is for Malice to appear by being summoned into reality. Now this obviously creates some problems because with the main gods of chaos, they can project other demons and entities into the material space, into reality, using the warp to do so, but they can't actually exist in the materium itself, or We've never seen any case or example that was able to happen. But demons, however, we know are able to do this, albeit requiring a vessel in which to do so, which is something like what Malice does. So this one is definitely something that I would place into the unknown category, not to mention there's only a singular reference to it, so it is open to interpretation. However, I base my assessment that Malice is a minor god on the greater understanding we have of the story related to Malal and Malice. But even within the context of in the galaxy, in the universe itself, you could still see it as being a godlike entity, mainly because the Sons of Malice assert that it is, and we don't have anything really to counter that. But as I've said it myself before, it's the warp, it's all a jumbled mess, so who really knows what's real and what's not? For the sake of argument though, I will continue on my position that Malice is what's believed to be what's referred to as a minor chaos god. We know of course the four main chaos gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle and Slaanesh, but along with these in the warp are many strange entities and spirits which have no particular love for mortal creatures either, and who will regularly attempt to assault and prey upon those who enter its realm, not to mention things like the insidious enslavers. It has also been theorised that there could potentially be more minor chaos gods of what we referred to as chaos. Now, some will consider this completely inviable out of the gate and not established within the lore, and this is true. When we're talking about minor chaos gods, there's not really anything particularly substantial. Malice really stands out. However, as I explained in the last video, some things are simply more established than others. And when it comes to chaos and the warp, in my opinion, almost anything is really up for grabs because it's just about the most uncertain, poorly defined aspect of the entire 40k verse. So could there be more weirdo things in the vast space of the warp that we barely understand at all? There's no way that you could say that there couldn't be. And currently I've been thinking about this more. I've started to think about overlapping realities, mixed timelines, different visions of interpretation. A lot of people have asked me questions like, well, if what you're talking about canon and retcon is true, Luton, how could the 13th Black Crusade have happened in one way and then another way? How can that all kind of work together? Well, you know, this is getting back into my whole Dark Origins Chaos thing, which I have got on the way. And the Dark Origins of Chaos, thinking about the warp and how it functions and what it means and time and all this kind of stuff, you can start to get into things like alternate timelines, overlapping reality, and all this kind of stuff. Now, I don't think that kind of thing is going to necessarily be applicable at all places at all times, because obviously that would be kind of silly. But just on a slight tangent here, in the context of Cadia, and we're talking about the warp and timelines in the 13th Black Crusade, the way in which the galaxy was torn apart, you could certainly imagine that there were some very mixed up things happening there in terms of time and vision and where people are seeing things and what's actually happening. So I think there's some sphere, some scope for movement, there's some suspension of disbelief which can happen there, which enables those things to work. So my point is just that, like I said already, when it comes to the warp, it's this very shifting, moving entity where there's a lot of stuff people don't understand, there's a lot of things that you can't possibly understand just by kind of definition. And so that enables some leeway when it comes to a lot of details and how things work. And again, that's not going to sit very well for some people. Some people hate that. Some people want to have a nice, clearly locked down story. This is what happens at this date. This is what happens at this date. But honestly, that just isn't how 40k works. But Malice itself is an intriguing entity because unlike the other Chaos Gods who fight against each other, but ultimately want to achieve some form of complete domination, which is also believed to be impossible for them to achieve, hence their unending great game which always continues on unabated, Malice does not seek this. In fact, it's not really clear what ultimate goal Malice has, but on a more basic level, Malice desires, like the higher gods, to wage war against one another. However, unlike those higher gods, one thing that does seem clear is that Malice seeks to just destroy for the pure sake of destruction. Unclouded, unfiltered, meaningless, wanton destruction. Be that against chaos, or indeed anything else, even itself. So, is Malice a good Chaos God? Clearly the answer is no. In fact, you could almost make the argument that the four major Chaos Gods are more positive than Malice, because at least they embody some constructive aspects, like the honourable mortal combat for Khorne, ambition and desire for Tzeentch, hope out of despair for Nurgle, pleasure and again also desire for Slaanesh. Now, to be clear, all of those things are twisted to insane extremes, but at least at their core basic level, they are positive, somewhat constructive things. Whereas there is really nothing positive at all about Malice, nothing at all, unless you want to get into the twisted ideas that I've talked about before in terms of perception of what is good and bad, and if you came from one own perspective, how that could be distorted in terms of coming out of the warp. But for Malice, it's simply self-destructive, mindless carnage, with no ultimate goal, no constructive gain, no wider plan. It's just meaningless, irrational obliteration. Malice is not seeking destruction of the other Chaos Gods to acquire power or for any moral purpose. It represents anarchy and pure mindless destruction. It is the ethereal manifestation of this mentality that humans will demonstrate where they kill and destroy and wreak havoc for no other purpose than just because. The emotional impact of such mindless destruction and suffering has often been seen to be far more damaging than those caused by war for other reasons, pestilence or greed. For humans, mindless slaughter and destruction of achievements for no reason is one of the most difficult things to rationalize and come to terms with. Malice also represents something akin to a powerful self-disgust, a hatred of human nature, and moreover, a deep hatred of oneself. Essentially, it's meant to comprise all the concepts we consider to be mindlessly self-destructive. It's where people become completely lost souls and spiral down into a deep pit of feeling worthless, and maybe leading to physical damage even via slow poisoning with drugs and other excesses, as well as physical self-harm, even suicide. Additionally, those feelings towards oneself can be accompanied by a complete and total apathy for any consequences for the individual or for the wider impact upon others. Essentially, for a mortal, reaching a point where you care so little about anything that you no longer care about the wider impact this self-destructive nature may have. To some degree, this could be seen as being almost emotionless, which seems a strange contradiction for a Chaos God, who we know gain a lot of power from the extremes of emotion. So it's possible we don't fully understand how Malice feeds off of this. It could be that this concentrated apathy almost becomes something like an emotion, even though it's not an emotion. There are references in the Labyrinth that talk about Malice's divine gifts of untold power that would send his elite, most exalted warriors to walk the dark paths of the galaxy, slaying their enemies with cold efficiency. This theme of cold efficiency and behaving with no emotion comes up again and again with the Sons of Malice. As I've postulated before, I don't believe faith alone is what feeds chaos or the Emperor, and this should be especially obvious with the Emperor because of how he requires being fed constantly with sacrifice. Because faith isn't really an emotion, it's a committed realization to your belief system. Now that can still provide you with solace and confidence, it can make you feel things, but it in and of itself is not a feeling, even though it can sort of appear that way. If you want to hear my expanded thoughts about this, then go and watch my Emperor Part 3 video and the addendum which comes after. But where this leads me to is perhaps an understanding of why it is that Malice is not a more significant power, because although it doesn't seem to represent a specific sphere of emotion, it does have other things going on for it, as I mentioned already. And in knowing that, we can know that the other Chaos Gods represent more like feelings through actions than just pure specific emotion. So I think it can well be that the extremity of your actions and how much they're focused toward a specific god does have relevance. It's also worth considering that a primary synonym for malice is also spite, which obviously aligns with the actions of its followers and core principles, to enact suffering on others intentionally, to hurt, to upset, even when those actions might cause the person who is spiting harm themselves as well. Spiteful actions and words are delivered so that it's clear the individual delivering them is doing so only so as to annoy or hurt or upset the individual they're directed toward. Also, it's worth noting that the other Chaos Gods collect huge amounts of power from humanity in general, as well as from those who specifically worship them with more extreme actions, whereas something like Malice, it has very few who follow it from our understanding, as well as these wider actions of spiteful behaviour minus destruction and carnage which are likely happening within humanity. Malice is though a difficult entity to place, because as any number of Chaos followers who form Chaos Undivided will also engage in actions that could be viewed similarly as a way to attract the attention or gain an audience with an entity, a demon of the warp. The Night Lord's Chaos Space Marines, for example, may regularly keep people in a state of perpetual agony as a way of utilising their suffering, not completely dissimilar actually to the Dark Eldar, except that obviously one is using it to attract chaos and the other is using it to keep them at bay. But one Night Lord, for example, in order to connect with a demon, was just burning through many prisoners, methodically flaying them to death on a marble slab like raw pieces of meat, one after the other, until the whole floor of the torture chamber was basically an ocean of blood, and the bodies were just discarded as gibbering wrecks nearby. And this is one reason why Malice is an awkward creation, and why it sort of sits in between all the other gods, because you have other Marines, other chapters doing very similar things, so how come they don't kind of align? It's a difficult entity to frame. I think if I had to choose a rationalization, I would say that the followers of Malice derive some gratification from this continual wanton destruction or even self-destructive attitudes, except that this doesn't even seem to have to be physical. It could also be similar to Tzeentch by way of creating disruption and anarchy through surreptitious actions. The more I've come to think about it, Malice to me seems to sit not outside of the main gods, but in a way at the centre of them. It's more a combination of, clearly not all, but a select group of aspects from the more destructive elements of those gods. So in many ways, you might say that with their powers combined, they can summon Malice, Destroyer of Worlds. So now we come to the Space Marine chapter, the Sons of Malice, and they are traitors to the Imperium, much like Chaos Marines. But unlike Chaos Marines, they were not immediately designated as traitors, but originally referred to as a renegade chapter. At least in the eyes of the Imperium, this means they are not considered to have been corrupted by Chaos. Now, in the more current period for the Sons of Malice, this obviously seems no longer to be the case, but this is probably because the Imperium initially did not fully understand what had happened to the Sons of Malice. Then later, due to their ongoing behaviour, this became more clarified, and now they are most certainly seen as heretics. It's also unclear what their original chapter designation was before the Sons of Malice, because such records have long since been purged. And before we get into more details about the Sons of Malice, there's a couple of red flags I discovered that we need to cover. Now the first is that sometimes you might read reference about a Sons of Malice chapter master, Bakal Drak. Now despite this character being on the 40k wiki and discussed in dotted places online, as far as I can determine, this originates entirely from a fan fiction, not from any official material. I have trawled through all existing material about the Sons of Malice these past 2 days, most of which I physically own, and I found no mention of this figure anywhere in any shape or form, or even alluded to, which goes to show, as I always say, don't believe everything on the wiki. Many people don't seem to realise that much of, but certainly in my experience not all, but indeed most material on 40k wikis are basically verbatim copy-pastes from official material, so that means usually you're solid. However, you sometimes get these odd references creep in that have been mentioned somewhere, sometime, on an obscure forum, and then somehow ended up on a wiki. In relation to the Drak thing, hilariously, the guy himself who actually wrote the fanfiction even put in his post saying, "This is hilarious, I've seen people quoting this as a real thing now." Now this is actually very bad, because Warhammer 40,000 is confusing enough as it is, but when you start having things like this becoming accepted and talked about, before you know it, people are starting to call a Baneblade a scout tank. Anyway, who knows how these things get to happening. But in this specific instance, what I think has made it more believable for people is that the name Bakal Drak is very obviously an anagram of Caleb Dark, and this was the original Chaos Champion in the actual material for Malal. Now, I say this is an anagram, it's barely moving a couple of letters, but anyway, on the wiki, it also talks about a gene seed origin, which also seems to be complete speculation and fanfiction from this same headcanon. So, in regards to both, unless somebody can point me at a specific piece of material where either of these things are mentioned, I'm adding it onto my pile of unofficial misdirections, along with my favourite Baneblade scout tank, and the classic grandfather Nurgle, people thinking this actually means something when it has absolutely zero to do with Chaos God chronology. The only senior figure we see officially mentioned for the Sons of Malice, and who is very definitely a chapter master, is one Lord Cathal. But wait, I'm not done yet. There's also another semi-common confusion surrounding the Sons of Malice, where they're designated as being one of 20 Space Marine chapters referred to as the Astartes Priestess. Now, apparently the mere mention of the number 20 combined with the word Astartes is enough to make people freak out and start wild assumptions that somehow, despite the timelines being totally out of whack, they are one of the 2 missing original 20 legions. Now, it's so obviously not this that I feel stupid even having to state it, but for clarity, no, the Sons of Malice were not one of the 2 missing legions purged from the original 20 ASTARTES, and then all Imperial records were expunged. The ASTARTES Praeses were simply 20 chapters founded after the heresy to guard the regions surrounding the Eye of Terror, so it has nothing at all to do with the legions themselves at the beginning. So with those interesting caveats done, we can return to the Sons of Malice. Now when it comes to chapters who have turned traitor, the numbers who have done this can only be estimated at. Why they do so is difficult to say, though some circumstances of such rebellion can be at least theorised. Even within the ranks of the Adeptus Ministorum, no clerics drawn between 2 different worlds are going to share the same view of the nature of the god even that they worship. Theosophical debates rage divided in their understanding of the Emperor's divinity. We see this in the Inquisition as well. But despite their agreed figure of worship, debate is still going to occasionally turn into division, and division into aggression. And this happens all throughout the Imperium. So a great many worlds are going to express their devotion to the Emperor in a relatively unique manner, or at least on a sliding scale. And this also applies to Space Marine chapters, who may choose to revere the Emperor and their own Primarchs in a manner that's fairly unique to themselves. Many will adore him not as a god, but as a founder and patron of the Space Marine legions, while the beliefs of other chapters may diverge even further. These deviations have occasionally led to frictions and even open conflict between Astartes themselves and Adeptus Ministorum. Now, such a conflict is unlikely to arise from a simple difference of opinion. However, for no matter how abhorrent a member of the ecclesiarchy may find the beliefs of a Space Marine chapter, or Inquisitors for that matter, there's no denying that the Space Marines are the living embodiment of the Emperor's divine wrath, and their mandate is granted by the Emperor himself. Now, open conflict is more likely to arise from the actions of a cleric, say overstepping their bounds of authority. It can only be assumed that insanity, treachery or worse, perhaps demonic or alien intervention, would in most cases lie at the heart of the matter. But on occasion, it may be that an Inquisitor who moves against a chapter, for many Astartes such an action would be completely intolerable, and for Inquisitors this would only be considered in the absolute most extreme of circumstances, because an entire chapter of Space Marines is a foe that few armies could hope to challenge. And upon declaring such a chapter excommunicatus, an Inquisitor will attempt to determine the root cause of the rebellion in order to gauge the potential obstacles there's going to be in neutralising it. Should an Inquisitor suspect the corruption of chaos as the reason for the chapter's fall from grace, then Grey Knights might be mobilised. Should a doctrinal heresy prove the immediate cause, then Elite of the Adeptus Sororitas might be the only force considered capable of prosecuting a war of faith against the wayward chapter. In any regard, such an event is of such importance that it would likely attract the attention of the commander of the Imperium. Even an Inquisitor would not bring forth such accusations without irrefutable evidence. And in saying this, actually gaining that evidence against a suspected renegade chapter would usually be near to impossible. And the reason for this is that even loyal chapters view outsiders with caution and would not admit them to their inner sanctum without express rationalization for doing so. And in the rare instance of a chapter actually publicly abandoning its vows to the Emperor, then obviously no investigation would be necessary, as the evidence would be clearly visible and damning in the extreme. Again, it is not recorded exactly how many chapters have been purged in this way, as all record of their existence will be expunged upon their defeat, but it can be estimated that as many as a dozen chapters have been completely destroyed and subsequently deleted from record, while a small number of others have been declared excommunicatus, and then these are still at large somewhere in the galaxy. The Badab uprising demonstrated that there can in fact exist degrees of rebellion. Aside from the Astral Claws, 3 other chapters rebelled against the rule of the Imperium during the conflict: the Lamenters, Executioners and the Mantis Legion, who are also known as the Mantis Warriors, probably to avoid any confusion there. These chapters simply found themselves on the wrong side of the conflict, and it would seem that hubris rather than heresy kept them fighting for over a decade. Many notable chapters have found themselves under investigation or engaged in open conflict against other factions. In an area as large as the Imperium, grievance and misunderstanding are seen to be unavoidable from time to time. The chapters that sided with the Astral Claws at Badab were investigated after this was resolved and found to be free from treachery. However, their homeworlds were forfeited to the loyalist chapters who fought against them, and the rebels sent on a penitent crusade as punishment for their crime. Often, the progress of the fall of a chapter goes unseen until the dramatic moment at which it is judged to have crossed the line and turned renegade. In fact, even the term renegade is only relevant to outsiders, a matter of judgment rather than objectivity. For example, a Space Marine chapter may subjugate a rebel world and be welcomed by the survived populace as saviours and begged to rule over them. Such a situation is not without precedent, for the Ultramarines rule an entire realm, but this is most definitely outside of the mandate of a Space Marine chapter, and so the sin of pride may lead a chapter down the road to ruin. So as the traitor legions fled to the Eye of Terror after their defeat at Terra, so too have other rebels sought to establish themselves in areas of the galaxy where the Imperium may not easily follow. Now the Sons of Malice are one such chapter. The Sons were founded in order to guard the western reaches of the Eye of Terror, but instead they ultimately fled into the Eye itself after an Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus unveiled their gruesome heretical behaviour. Some Space Marine chapters will fall into disrepute by nature of their station, some worlds proving to be so difficult to exist in or so strange in their practices that over time this has led to a slow bleeding corruption. Originally, the captain of the first company of the Sons of Malice, Cathal, was instrumental in the chapter's fall from the Emperor's grace. Cathal and his company had successfully concluded the Silix 225 campaign, in which 3 sub-oceanic hives in the rebellious Silix system were scoured of the heretics who were threatening to depressurize them as an expression of their misguided devotion. The company's prolonged victory celebrations, led by the murderous Cathal, were observed by Inquisitor Pietas, a senior member of the Ordo Hereticus, who was revolted at what she saw as practices verging on cannibalistic. Pietas immediately mobilized a strike force of Adeptus Sororitas Celestians who deployed from orbit aboard drop pods, making planetfall in the midst of the company at the height of their celebration. And this strike force found Cathal and his company a horde of fevered maniacs. Having worked themselves into a state of animalistic barbarity over the course of their celebrations, Cathal's armour was splattered with gore and blood ran from his mouth as he presided over the ceremony. Cathal and his brethren fell upon the strike force with a savagery the Inquisitor was entirely unprepared for. The Celestians fought bravely, but their number were far too few, and their faith, though strong, could not overcome the sheer fury, rage and unrepentant brutality of Cathal and his men. The Sons of Malice reportedly fight in utter silence, and for those who have fought against them, this is something that creates a deep, disturbing aura surrounding them. By the light of the burning torches, Cathal cornered the Inquisitor and dragged her before his altar alive, where she was then horribly ritually sacrificed. This heinous deed earned the Sons of Malice excommunication. The native tribes were then almost entirely eradicated by the Sororitas and Cadian 331st in a planet-wide campaign of brutal, merciless, Imperial-sanctioned genocide, so basically Wednesday for the Imperium. Skelos was declared perdita, this designation not specifically explained anywhere, but it translates as lost, which makes sense. Captain Cathal is now a truly ancient Marine. Having lived far beyond the age of any mortal human, he still remains as the Sun's current chapter master. Every century the Sons of Malice will make a pilgrimage and return to an ancient ship known as the Labyrinth. This is a huge Imperial ship long since operational. Its rotting metal carcass drifts around the warp in the Eye of Terror. It is essentially a space hulk, but not to be confused with the space hulks of the Dark Age of technology. The Labyrinth serves as a gathering place for the Sons of Malice, and it is considered sacred to them, but for any other who enter, it is surely a hellscape. Every century, the members of the Sons of Malice will attend the Labyrinth gathering regardless of their current status or with which enemy they're engaged in. For some, it can take many months to reach the Labyrinth, but it is also reported that as many as 1,000 slaves of any and all races in the galaxy, human or otherwise, are brought to the Labyrinth for this specific event. Each brother of the chapter can then isolate themselves, where they will proceed to eat alive the slave assigned to them. It's also described, though, that they will gather in groups publicly, having discarded their power armour, and congregate to then devour their victim. Slathered in the blood and ichor of their chosen sacrifice, they've even been known to consume loyalist Astartes, keeping them alive as long as possible in the process, as blood-curdling screams echo throughout the vast ancient vessel. At this gathering, some of the Sons of Malice will set off into the halls of the Labyrinth to compete for a place among the legendary Doomed Ones. Only one can make it to the end and escape. The rest will either die or be transformed into the beasts that inhabit the ship as the warp slowly corrupts it. But for many in the Sons of Malice, this was not made clear. Those taking part in the trial were known to have even encountered those who failed but remained trapped within its endless vast corridors, presumably existing here for at least over a century. And it seemed that while several brothers took part in the challenge, only one could then proceed to this final stage, something they gradually became aware of. This would then leave the rest trapped. As the chosen few progress through the labyrinth, it suddenly becomes apparent that the mutant horrors patrolling the labyrinth and killing them are in fact failed Sons of Malice, who did not complete their labyrinth challenge and have slowly become twisted, mutated horrors by the warp itself. The symbolism, of course, of this challenge should be fairly obvious, that the Renegade Astartes are forced to actively fight against one another, something which becomes steadily more clear as they discover that then only one of them can ultimately be victorious, or so they believed. As he neared the portal, Agon stopped, slowly turning with a smile. "I'm truly sorry, my brothers, but it seems I must leave you. I wish that Something streaked from the dark, cutting Agon off mid-sentence. A huge chitin claw, ancient and battered, gripped around his waist, lifting him 5 meters into the air. Agon screamed, blood gurgling from his mouth as the claw squeezed tight. The 2 halves of his body fell to the ground, innards spilling onto the hard steel decking. Then it walked from the shadows. 4 massive limbs carried its great bulk forward. It was a mass of flesh and steel metal plates cauterized to a body of seething blubber. 2 great claws reached out into the 4 and clacked together menacingly, but it was the head that was the most hideous, a twisted, bloated replica of a face that might once have been human, but was now so savage and malign as to be almost unrecognizable. As Brother Invictus watched in horror, its great jaws opened, and it bellowed forth its incessant call. "Let me out!" It screamed, filling the hall with its ear-splitting roar. It was now all too clear. This was no ancient war cry Invictus had been hearing, it was simply the maddened ranting of an insane mutant, caged for centuries and left to the mercy of the warp's corrupting influence, and now it was the only thing standing in the way of victory. Now, for an event like the Labyrinth, even among Chaos Marines, such self-destructive horror is not all too common, not in such a designated, planned fashion anyway. Ultimately, having lied and killing his brother Marine, only one would remain, Brother Invictus. And before this final Labyrinth, the challenge had taken place 10 times previous, finally 11 being Malice's sacred number. Much of what the Sons do seems to be dictated around the number 11, with each victor's body having been stored in caskets until this final champion had been identified. Brother Invictus saw these caskets being dragged out and feeling that he was victorious and would finally be rewarded by Malice for his huge effort. Mysterious chanting echoed through the chamber as Chapter Master Cathal spoke to him. "You've proven yourself the best among us, Invictus. You have proven you're without peer for your strength and cunning. You're the most potent, the latest to prove himself worthy to join the doomed ones." The 10 other champions surrounding Invictus in the caskets had been interred but were seemingly still alive. They were described as their bodies remaining robust, but their minds being vacuous, suggesting that these had slowly become vegetabilized, having been held captive for so long, or else deliberately mind-wiped. These, along with Invictus, who was by now realizing to his horror that he would not be able to gain any special power to allow him to fight onward, they would instead all be sacrificed so that Malice could finally appear to them, and the Sons of Malice could begin their crusade to retake their homeworld of Skelos. As the darkness descended upon them, his flesh began to flay from his bones, his entire body becoming consumed. All the Sons of Malice would watch on, observing this spectacle in total silence. After it was all over, all that was left was a dark revenant. Eyes burning, here before them stood the renegade god of anarchy and terror. It was Malice. The world of Skelos itself exists from the Imperial perspective as a stark example to any who would test the tolerance of the appointed representatives of the Holy Order of the Emperor's Inquisition. The Imperium still believed the Sons of Malice had continued to patrol within the Eye of Terror, where they waged a hate-fueled war against anyone and anything that they encountered, be that Imperium or indeed more regularly followers of Chaos. Yet it eventually became apparent that the Sons of Malice had not completely abandoned their homeworld, and they still venture out from the Eye of Terror itself, specifically seen at Skelos, their former homeworld, and the reasons for these dangerous incursions, or what if any further plans they have within Imperial space, are unknown. In addition to their unusual habit of fighting in near total silence, methodically and with no mercy whatsoever, the Sons of Malice are vicious, brutal and bloodthirsty in the extreme, and this coupled with their habit of capturing living enemy or even just innocent civilians for their strange rituals or to feed upon while their victims are still alive makes them easily as disturbing as any of the other Chaos Marines such as Night Lords, Iron Warriors or even the Death Guard. Now, the true origin of Malice and Malal are perhaps to some degree more interesting than its in-universe iteration, although also quite comically, the consequences were appropriately self-destructive. It's fairly ironic that a fictional figure themed around uncaring self-destruction would lead to it basically making itself unusable for both parties involved, thereby destroying itself. And this all begins before 40k, in fact 2 years before it had even been created. We're back in the world of the very early 1980s world of Warhammer Fantasy, and in the late 80s Warhammer Fantasy as Games Workshop's flagship concept was beginning to be expanded upon. The 4 main Chaos Gods that still exist today had been conceptualized, their general core concepts were fleshed out and have remained largely unchanged to this day. Games Workshop, as it was at the time, wanted to expand upon this core base of gods by creating a number of what were referred to as minor Chaos Gods. And just as with the original Rogue Trader for 40k, these early times were quite experimental, with many concepts just being thrown to the wall to see what stuck best. And later, with the release of 2nd edition, it became clear that a lot of stuff had been omitted from those original times because they'd cut away the dead wood that wasn't working with the aim of creating stronger core brands for both the fantasy and 40k iteration. Basically, to keep the things that were working and drop the stuff that was not. Before any of that though came while they were still toying with these ideas about minor Chaos Gods, and Games Workshop brought on board 2 freelance writers to assist in this development. Writers whose names you should recognise as they were legends writing considerable material for Judge Dredd, John Wagner and Alan Grant. Now, Games Workshop wanted to collaborate on a comic book series for the Citadel Journal. I say collaborate, they wanted them to write it for them, that would expand on this idea of the minor Chaos Gods. And this series would centre around the figure of Caleb Dark. You remember me mentioning that earlier. With this comic series, The Quest of Caleb Dark, Dark was very much what you would qualify as an anti-hero. He was a Chaos champion. His most notable accessory was a shield that has become very visually synonymous with what we recognise as Malal and Malice, the distinctive black and white split pattern. So that has actually originated right back from the very beginning. So Dark was this champion for Malal, as per the destructive nature of the god. And in the comics, Dark is even seen to be self-harming as a way to commune with Malal, the god itself, because this god aligns with those exhibiting a highly self-destructive nature. As Games Workshop was preparing the original Realm of Chaos books, Slaves to Darkness and The Lost and the Damned, which side note also contained material for 40k, Games Workshop, as it was then, wanted to obviously include the narratives related to Caleb Dark and Malal. The problem they encountered was that Wagner and Grant had, as sensible freelance writers, copyrighted their creations that had been sold on to Games Workshop in the comics, and this is something that as a freelance creator you're completely allowed to do, unless it's otherwise stipulated in your contract, because if something is your creation, you're basically going to want to prevent that from being exploited later down the line. Now, in modern times this would never happen because any contract these days would explicitly state that whatever you're creating for a company, whether you're a freelancer or working there, becomes the property of that company that you're working for. This is just completely standard. But back here in the early days, it seems that the guys heading up Games Workshop had not immediately thought of this issue. These were more innocent days, indeed. And it's been described later as merely a misunderstanding and a clash of culture at the time. But it basically comes down to simply not a properly prepared contract that enabled Games Workshop to own the rights to the material that was being made for them. You live and learn, don't you? However, it's basically unknowable if there was ever any malicious intention behind this, in the sense that did Wagner and Grant deliberately do this on the sly, knowing that if they'd just bothered to flag it with Games Workshop, they'd have been told straight away, wow, no way, we need to amend those contracts immediately. We can't ever really know this. It might have just been 2 writers very actively making sure that they maintained control of their characters. They didn't see anything in their contract which said otherwise, so it could have just been a very simple misunderstanding. And it's so long in the past now that anybody's true intention is total speculation. No one could really say otherwise. But the key point of this is that as of 1988, there was no further mention of Malal anywhere, certainly not in the Realm of Chaos books, and in essence the concept of Malal as an entity in Warhammer Fantasy was and is dead. More importantly though, and this is my opinion, I think that this copyright issue had big implications for Games Workshop, firstly in it still wanting to probably get further use out of Malal. It was quite a good concept, but also that I think this incident had far bigger ramifications in the sense that Games Workshop from here on became very aggressive in controlling their copyright for creations, right up to the most recent times with Primaris and the Eldari, when it became clear a little while ago that Space Marines and Eldar were not quite unique enough names. It's been constructive for the community in the past 10 years that Games Workshop have relaxed a little bit, because it really helps further community creations like, say, the ASTARTES series or text-to-speech, things that would have simply been unimaginable previously with the way Games Workshop would have approached things years and years ago. But what I'm getting at here is that with a due sense of irony, the creation that was Malal and Malice actually ended up being, that's right, highly self-destructive force even outside of the lore, which I think is quite hilarious. Games Workshop, for some reason that we will likely never know, were unable to come to an amicable agreement regarding the use of Malal, which, it's worth remembering, Games Workshop back then was not a very sizable company as it is today. Most likely, but again, my total speculation, Wagner and Grant either wanted too much for the use of their characters, or perhaps they just outright refused for them to be used. Maybe they thought they wanted to do something with them themselves later on, although that would have been very difficult because all the other stuff was owned by Games Workshop, so they were never really going to be able to do anything with those characters. Seems strange that they wouldn't just sell them, make a buck and move on, but there you go. Either way, Malal was done in Warhammer Fantasy, although it should be noted there were very light references to Renegade Chaos followers over the years. But this didn't stop it surreptitiously bleeding into 40k as the figure known as Malice. So lastly, my final opinion on Malice. Does Malice exist within the galaxy of 40k? My answer to this is rationalised in two parts. Firstly, as we already explored, once something is part of the 40k verse, it remains part of it. Rewrites can occur, contradictions can occur, but once it's out there, it has happened, maybe in an overlapping reality as I said before, or similarly some alternate temporarily merged warp-skewed timeline. That's really my favourite current rationalisation. But Malice is certainly not just some entity alluded to in one-off mentions. It's not something which is like, oh, has that been overwritten or changed? Nope, it's been repeatedly given a wink and a nod in actual written material also of official publications for many years via the Sons of Malice, and as recently as last year in 2019. I think the best way to put it is that Games Workshop, at the least, want to keep Malice as an option on the table. There's certainly nothing that explicitly goes against it, beyond the fact that it's only been mentioned sporadically from time to time. Overall, Malice via the Sons of Malice has more material going for it than some other more obscure things, like the Sancprimus Portum that I talked about recently. In some respects, it's referenced even more than the Emperor doing his trip to Moloch, and people can't let go talking about that. The second part of my thinking is related to a favourite example of mine that demonstrates why obscure lore elements not being mentioned often remain relevant, and that something not being mentioned is absolutely no reason to discount it. And I'm talking of course about Aeneid and the Inari. Now, Aeneid, who is supposed to destroy Slaanesh and thereby enable the Eldar to once again be reborn with no fear of death, the reason Aeneid and the Inari are important here is because much like Malice, Aeneid existed formerly as just a single obscure reference in the 3rd edition, and then it was not mentioned at all until the most recent times of the 8th edition of 40k, where suddenly Aeneid has now become a core part of the 40k narrative. It's a massive part of what's happening right now. So both these very straightforward, easy to understand points, I feel, should quite readily demonstrate that ideas mentioned decades previously in the lore can not only be reinvigorated, but become major parts of the lore once again. Now, I will also freely admit that I do think there is some doubt and further evidence required to establish just exactly what Malice is in 40k. Is he a powerful demon or some form of minor god? I would also say, how do you define what the difference is there? Just off the top of my head, I guess a god can create and do things like that, whereas a demon just exists. Both are immortal in the sense that we understand that definition. I think now all that's left to say is, how long will it be before we see Malice once again? What could it mean for the galaxy, and indeed the Chaos Gods, in this time of supreme disruption and chaos throughout the galaxy?